the simplest thing of a Roku going offline a Roku going offline means kids getting lost in the parking lot and lines of traffic backing up off the street to where literally the police are showing up to help manage the chaos that just began because a Roku went offline. So when we're talking about how critical the monitoring of this stuff is, it's a big deal.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go.
So we have very special guests on the podcast this week, and I'm very excited for this discussion. It's actually someone that we at Paessler have dealt with before. We've had a few dealings with in the past. Jeremy's also made some videos. And I'd like to welcome you to the podcast, Jeremy and Eric. And we'll start with some introductions. Jeremy, let's start with you.
Sure. My name is Jeremy Chara, and as of this morning, I added a skill, which is making a sandwich out of 2 Eggo waffles and a egg and a piece of ham that made all my kids extraordinarily jealous. And besides that, I'm also the owner of VIA. We're a managed service provider that provides technology services for primarily charter schools. We really narrowly focus on the education world. And doing everything around that.
Very cool. And that is one cool skill to have, Jeremy. And I must say, I did not learn anything as cool as that today on my side. So I feel like it's a failed day somehow. And we also have Eric here. Maybe you can introduce yourself, Eric.
Yes. So I'm Eric Pope. I work here at VIA, and my role here is services architect. And so I help develop and set the services that we provide to charter schools.
Okay, very cool. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. Actually, is one of the focuses that you have. You have many cool focuses, and also folks can go and have a look in the show notes. We're going to link to all of the links for VIA and for the 2 guests this week. But the thing that we're focusing on is something that I think a lot of people are quite interested in is the educational requirements for IT. So this is one of the services that you at VIA provide. And yeah, I think we just want to dive into that and figure out just exactly what the kind of challenges that we have with monitoring an educational facility. And let's start with that. Maybe give me an idea of what a typical school infrastructure looks like. What kind of things we're dealing with there?
Yeah, and I'll just add a bit probably to the introduction. I'm the guy that looks at things nowadays and goes, "That's amazing, that's awesome." Eric's the guy that builds it all. So I'll give you my perspective, and then he'll tell. We'll tweak all of that. So the school infrastructure is primarily, if you know network builds, you could call it a typical 3-tier model. That is access, distribution, and core. Most of the schools that we deal with in the charter school world only get up to about the distribution layer. They don't have backbones and large campuses. We are stepping into some educational facilities that have a core environment. But I'd say I'll say when we're done with it, it follows a design. A lot of them that we walk into, it's more of just, hey, we connected stuff and it works sometimes. Eric,
right?
Do you have any other perspective on that?
So the other aspect of it is we're in the cloud world now. I mean, it's not only just the infrastructure within the campus. I mean, we've got Microsoft 365. We've got these education softwares and things that they do testing on and have education pumped to them through the internet and things like that. And then there's other requirements for student testing and all kinds of things that they have to deal with. There's also ancillary services, whether it's a phone system, paging, and other things like that all get tied into that same backbone that schools need to provide their services.
Yeah, actually, so glad you brought that up because a lot of what we do is we're getting people to the cloud. But at the same time, realizing there's still some local services that are needed. There's security systems, video surveillance, where sometimes just going straight to the cloud isn't an option. So it is a blend. I think when we're talking about challenges and what the school infrastructure, I'll just say the typical school infrastructure, yes, a lot fewer, a lot less. There aren't as many servers as it used to be, but there are still servers there, and they still perform a lot of the key roles that the schools need.
Yeah. And I think this is a thing that a lot of, not just educational facilities are facing, but also a lot of corporate and normal network infrastructures. People are realizing it's not just in the cloud. There's also a lot of stuff that is still on premises, and that's probably going to remain on premises, like you say. And I can also imagine that in schools, it's a case of, like you said, they were just getting it connected, that the real expertise might not always be there. They're just kind of getting it to the point where it's functional, it's operational, and then that's kind of it, because that's maybe where their knowledge ends. Or is that kind of what you're finding as well?
Yeah, we walk into a lot, and also realizing that charter schools and schools in general, when they start, often will take over or have a shared building with other customers. So a lot of times when we come in, we're managing not only the school, but we're taking on the infrastructure either that was previously a strip mall or previously a warehouse or a church. And sometimes those people have left, and all the history comes with it. And sometimes we end up with almost a 2-for-1 customer because we end up working with those facilities as well.
Yeah. So let's hone in on some of the things that schools would need. You mentioned some of the things are in the cloud, other things are still on premises. There's local things that they need. What are the typical big concerns? Let's focus on the big concerns and big requirements of schools.
So one of the things that is really important to schools is student testing. And there's a lot of aspects to student testing, and the things that we do to manage and provide a good environment to do student testing is the wireless, because most times it's normal classroom, you're sitting in front of a whiteboard and a teacher and they're teaching stuff, but then there's student testing. Pull out a laptop cart, and now instead of 2 connections to an access point, you have got 30 or 60 connections to access point. And so that's one of the things that we really try to design properly and monitor properly so that activity goes smoothly. And so part of that is not only monitoring our wireless and infrastructure across that environment, which includes things like capacity planning and how many airtime utilization, how many clients are connected to the AP, and how we're going to make sure that there's proper balance across the access points and things like that. But then you have your uplinks out to the internet, and then monitoring the services and things like that they're connected to. They have standardized testing, and there's different aspects of where those services are and how much latency and load they have on those, and having an ideal understanding of all those different aspects that play into a successful student testing day.
Yeah, and it's wild. It's funny because I think if you're not used to an educational environment, you might hear that and be like, oh yeah, student testing. Oh man, it's a thing. Like if you... In one sense, student testing is how schools are scored. And there's such a psyche with that to where if there's a wireless issue and 30 students get kicked off and they have to refresh, you're going to have an uproar from the school because now, in a nutshell, there's okay, you just messed with the students' concentration. They all have to give they're stressed, and so monitoring that and making sure that you do act, there's obviously a lot of design and accurate capacity planning, but ensuring that at any given point, and I know you just talked about in a classroom, bam, 30 devices, 60 devices that you didn't see online suddenly come online. But there's also schools that will have all the students come to the gymnasium or a multi-purpose, a giant room. And you'll have not 30 or 60, but hundreds at any point, just bam, immediately come online, and you need it to be perfect all the time. So, Eric, in terms of monitoring, what kind of thing, I know you kind of rattled off things to look at. I mean, what would you say is like the top 3 things that you look at when we set up monitoring there?
So we look at the requirements from the testing organization. They have like a minimum of like 1.5 meg up to 3 meg per student as a recommendation stuff. So we look at, okay, can this access point at this frequency range handle that? Are we having issues with that? Some of the thing about that is during prep before student testing, getting those devices on, sometimes there's updates and things like that. So we're able to tell, okay, by looking at our monitoring, we could see that things have stabilized after setup. And so we're okay, now it's good to go because now we're stabilized into a time that it's not going to interfere with stuff. And so those are some of the aspects is like the bandwidth and stuff. But then there's other things that we look into as well. We have NetFlow set up as well so that we could say, hey, why is so-and-so doing Netflix right now? Don't you think that's a lower priority than student testing? And different things like that just makes the overall experience richer for students.
Yeah.
Right. So this is interesting to me. So I've got several questions around this, but the one that I want to ask first is because you're providing the service to not just one educational facility, so there's multiple. So you're watching this. Are you watching this? Do you have a single dashboard that you're kind of watching all the schools, or do you have a routine where you're checking on the different dashboards for different schools? How does that look? I just want to understand that from a more of an MSP point of view.
So day to day, we don't necessarily have dedicated people for monitoring some of this, but around student testing, we'll set up more of a war room where we'll have a communication with the school and things like that. Where we will have a dedicated person, and there'll be certain things that we are looking out for and being more aware of during those things. So we'll have a schedule of when this school versus that school will have and provide the different resources.
Okay.
So
yeah, well, and I'll also jump in and say the event, we'll say, can be. I mean, we're talking about obviously monitoring right now, but there's a lot of elements that can go into it. Like the war rooms typically happen when we first come back from a break, like a summer break or a winter break, because teacher, you're supposed to have set up where the teachers pull these laptops out beforehand and all that, but sometimes they may pull them out and bam, a Chromebook or a Windows update hits. And you just watch the bandwidth spike. Now you can see that on the monitoring side, but a lot of that is just setting up best practices around that too.
And I assume you've got things like notifications that get triggered when thresholds are reached, so that it's also, you can be proactive about seeing when bandwidth is getting to critical levels, right? The other thing that I wanted to ask, what was the other thing that I wanted to ask around this? Oh, and what about, I should imagine that perhaps trends over a longer term are also important. Do you keep an eye on sort of historical data over time to see, okay, the bandwidth usage in this facility is rising and rising? Is that something that you do as well?
Yeah, for sure. And so one of the things that we look at is not only the bandwidth, but number of connected devices. And so as schools get more connected to the cloud and connected to IT in general, there's more and more devices. And so part of that is knowing capacity and when are we going to have to update and deploy more access points, because more and more requirements are needed for things like that. We ran into that just this year of because they're like, we're going to do a lot more student testing and a lot more intense testing, and not only just a single classroom at a time, but a whole wing of this area. Well, let's redesign your network and make sure that it could support that kind of thing. And so that's definitely one part of it. And then you talk about bandwidth and stuff. And so there's requirements and stuff. So are we really providing a good cost for how much bandwidth is being provided. So understanding really the real actual usage and making good recommendations off of that, because schools don't have the funding to just say, I need 5, 10 or 10 gig connections and we'll just deal with it. It's like, well, we don't really have the funding to do that. What can we afford and what do we need to actually purchase?
Yeah. And what you say about schools getting more and more connected, it is amazing to me, because I mean, when I went to school, and of course, this was back in South Africa. I don't know what it was like in the United States of America, but when I went to school, there were no devices in the classroom, and at best, we had an overhead projector that you used to plug into the wall and put slides on to project the things. But now even the chalkboards are digital screens and connecting to the internet. So I can only imagine how that must be progressing all the time. But also when dealing with educational facilities, there's of course, I would imagine, another aspect, and that's the regulatory aspect. I should imagine there's certain requirements that are defined that you have to meet. Maybe you can talk around that?
Yeah, well, I'd love to start that. And yes, there is. And in America, there's actually, and I'm sure it's this way in other countries as well, but many of the schools receive something called E-rate funding. In a nutshell, this is the government's way of saying, hey, we want to make sure that the schools get online. So the internet connection and anything that spreads that internet connection through the schools. So firewalls, routers, WAPs, switches, cabling, anything except the end device, all get partial government funding to make sure that internet access can be brought in. With that comes a lot of the requirements, primarily around content filtering. And so Eric actually set up a pretty sweet thing to catch content filtering, because it's one of those things, if you're not doing it or a service stops or kids can get through, funding can actually be at risk.
Yeah, so
Right.
the requirement is under the SIPA laws, and part of that is, like you said, is content filtering. And so what we do for schools is we provide content filtering, we enable it and set it up and everything else. And then to monitor it, to make sure it's still working, we typically have a GET HTTP request out to the internet to a known blocked website and make sure that we're getting the proper response. And so by doing that, we could validate for the regulatory that we're ensuring that it's set up and functioning for that organization.
Yeah, so we are trying to access porn all the time. Actually, on probably like
as part of your job,
right? As part of So every 60 seconds, we have a system set up to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hugely important as well. I think you're protecting young minds, and and obviously, like you said, there's a regulatory aspect of that as well. I think one of the things that you mentioned to me before was also something around telephony, where you have to ensure that those telephony services are in place.
Yes, telephony. Yes.
Did I say that wrong? I said that probably with. Please say it.
It's okay. I smile anytime somebody does. So yeah, telephony is a big thing for security primarily.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different points of it, because we tie our package in a lot with overhead paging phones and whatnot. So that relates to Bell systems and all the day-to-day operations, but there is a lot of security. It is a tier 1 service that if there's an issue, that needs resolved quickly. So we need to make sure that we know it is working. So there is components that change the VoIP signal to an analog signal that goes over the speakers. So we monitor those devices and make sure they're functioning. We have multicast that go to individual endpoint phones and things like that. So we could capture and make sure that packet is being sent. Part of that is logging and things like that. So sometimes students over here and learn how to do an all-call page. So which classroom did that page come from? So we have an audit log of where those came from. But all those tie into the different aspects of how we monitor and make sure that that phone system and paging work. Part of that is also the going out to 911 and making sure that the address and part of that information is passed properly so that there's proper response to those types of calls and whatnot.
Yeah, when it comes to education, I mean, there are a lot of unique things. Like I know we were talking about like student testing, thousands of devices coming online, but kids are nowadays walking devices. They come in with not just one, but many devices that end up online. And I know one of the things that we set up recently was like DHCP pool monitoring to make sure that, the number of addresses and segmenting groups from each other, you've got different pools of addresses so they don't end up exhausting. Along with, at the end of the day, it's also, it's a standard network environment. So a lot of the best practices that you would typically have with bandwidth monitoring. I mean, just before this started, we're running into a radius issue at some of the schools where some of the laptops weren't authenticating, and Eric and I were just trying to brainstorm that, and he brought up. He's like, well, we're actually, so we use Ubiquiti at a lot of the schools. It's a great solution. And he brought up, he said, well, I know the configuration on the WAPs hasn't changed. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know we were monitoring the config on the Ubiquiti WAPs. I'm like, well, that's awesome because it eliminates that whole thing. So just knowing that there was no configuration change that occurred between the beginning of the week and the end of the week, in terms of troubleshooting, eliminates a whole glut of stuff that would just be a whole alley of going down a wrong dark hole before we get there.
Yeah, just saves so much time, right?
Yeah,
right, exactly. One other thing, going back to phones and stuff, we talk about like capacity planning with student testing and other things like that. Well, with phones, it's the same kind of thing. We got beginning of the year startup. There's tons of registrations happening, tons of parents calling. What is the capacity to make sure that we're not hitting an upper end of concurrent calls and different things like that? And so that's what I mean is it's very much cyclical in nature, how schools work. And we always have to plan it around those worst case scenarios. And so we do a lot of baselining and a lot of monitoring to make sure, hey, you're hitting kind of close in this higher percentile of usage. Let's bump this up so that we don't run into an issue in the future.
Yeah. Well, it's just incredible because like when I thought of educational facilities before, I would never have imagined that there's all of this complexity that in just a simple educational facility, if you want to put it like that. But of course it is. They're connected. There's all these requirements. So it is really interesting to hear about that. And of course, if people have questions, I guess they can ask you as well. I'll put all the details, as I said, in the show notes. Do you guys have anything more that maybe I've missed?
1,000 things, but yeah, it's funny. Just as you were talking, and you said educational facilities, something I didn't even think about. So we rolled out. So something that you wouldn't even think about in a corporate environment is pickup. Lines of cars coming to get the children, and we actually rolled out an app. It's called Curb, the child pickup app. Which has external Wi-Fi. It has, Roku devices involved. It has television. And all of those things have to be monitored because, I know it's probably where you're saying you're like, yeah, of course. But I mean, if that goes down, it's not just like children getting lost in parking lots as parents are wandering around trying to find them. But I mean, lines of traffic that backs out on the street. It makes. What am I thinking of? Mission Impossible. This is just where there's a scene in Mission Impossible where Tom Cruise was, he was at a party and someone's like, well, what do you do? And, obviously he's Ethan Hunt. He's Mission Impossible. Yeah. But he goes, oh, I'm just a traffic engineer. And he goes, it's fascinating. A single brake light can be tracked back and the ripple effects in the traffic patterns. And, all the guys are like, yeah, whatever. But I know it's obviously a movie, but it's real. Like all of these things, if you're not monitoring them, man, it's like the simplest thing of a Roku going offline a Roku going offline means kids getting lost in the parking lot and lines of traffic backing up off the street to where literally the police are showing up to help manage the chaos that just began because a Roku went offline. So when we're talking about how critical the monitoring of this stuff is, it's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Well, I want to thank you guys for your time, for taking the time out to talk about this topic. And like I said, all of the details are in the show notes. Thank you, Jeremy and Eric.
Thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Thank
It
you.
was
It's
fun.
great connecting with you. Thanks again.